Alright, today's video is going to be about plant reproduction. We're going to end up going into a lot of detail about flowers because we're actually going to dissect those in class. In order to understand how different plants reproduce, you have to understand a concept called the alternation in generations. And this is kind of a complicated one because it looks different depending on the plant that you're looking at, and that will be impressed upon you as we go through this video. But what alternation in generations is, it's a property of plants in which they alternate between what's called a sporophyte generation and a gametophyte generation. Now the sporophyte generation is diploid. It produces spores or seeds. This could be an entire plant. This could be a structure within the plant. It kind of depends on what type of plant you're talking about. Gametophytes are, they produce haploid cells, the gametes. Now remember, diploid means 2 copies of each chromosome. Haploid means 1 copy of each chromosome. So the gametophyte is the plant or type of plant, or excuse me, not type of plant, the plant or structure of the plant that actually produces the gametes, whereas the sporophyte is the part that produces seeds. So here's how this looks when you take a look at mosses. Now, the vast majority of what you look at when you think of a moss, that green leafy stuff, that is the gametophyte of the moss. It can produce egg cells, sperm cells. Now, when the eggs get fertilized, a zygote forms and spores start to develop, and then a structure called the sporophyte grows out the top. You can see there's a stalk there and it has a capsule at the top, and that's going to hold on to the spores. Here's what it looks like in real life. The things that are coming out from the top, those are the sporophytes. So gametophytes are actually kind of the dominant life stage of mosses and other bryophytes, and the sporophyte is just kind of a weak structure that pops out there to help disperse the spores. So here's a bigger picture of that. This is different in pteridophytes. Pteridophytes being ferns, for example. Now, as we said, pteridophytes have these things called fronds, and that's where spores are produced. Okay, so wait, spores, that must mean those fronds and that big leafy part that we think of when we think of ferns, those are the sporophyte. So the dominant stage of ferns are sporophytes. Now, early on in its life, a fern has a structure at the bottom that looks like just kind of one small leaf, and the sporophyte structure before it grows depends on this. Now that structure is the gametophyte, and that's where gametes are being produced in the ferns. Okay, so you actually have the sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. It was the other way around sorry, there's a snowplow going by. It was the other way around in the mosses. Hopefully that's not drowning out my speaking. Anyway, so not finally, but we're going to talk about vascular plants with seeds. Now, generally, the dominant life stage of these are the sporophytes. And vascular plants do not actually require water for fertilization, whereas the mosses and the ferns, they both required water to help spread gametes. They will not reproduce if they don't have like a small puddle of water that gametes can move around through. Vascular plants do not require water for fertilization. So remember, angiosperms are flowering plants, gymnosperms are non-flowering plants. Now, in both angiosperms and gymnosperms, the gametophyte is actually a specific structure. It is the pollen grain. So right there, that is your gametophyte. And the female gametophyte is actually the embryo sac that is within the flower itself, or within the cone scales. So in the case of flowering plants and gymnosperms, the gametophyte and sporophyte are actually just a small part of the plant that's sort of embedded into a specific structure. Whereas in ferns and in mosses, it's this massive, it's a large structure, and it's very, very obvious. Now we're going to look at the structure of a flowering plant. Now, if you look at a flower from the top down, you would notice that they sort of occur in layers. Kind of like if you were looking at an onion, you were to cut it lengthwise, there's all those onion layers. Well, a flower is actually structured in a somewhat similar way, and each of those layers is what we call a whorl. Okay, think of a whorl as, and this is literally what it is. If you ever eat an artichoke, you have all the leaves around there. Well, every layer of leaves it's in itself a whorl. Okay, So here are all the different parts of a flower that we are about to go through. Now, sepals are green leaves that are sort of around the bottom of the flower, and they're somewhat protective. And they form something that is called the calyx of the flower before it blooms. You'll notice that before a flower blooms, there's kind of like this green thing that completely surrounds the flower before it. And it's like this oval-looking thing that's on the end of the stem. This is before you really start to see the petals come out. That structure is called the calyx, and the sepal is there to help form that protective layer around the flower before it blooms. Now, the colorful part that we all notice of the flower are the petals. They're the outer, they're actually technically leaves. They're specialized leaves. And they typically have the attractive colors to attract pollinators. Alright, so now we're going to work our way into the actual reproductive parts of the plant. So most flowers have a male structure and a female structure within them. Now the male structure, kind of the important part is what's called the anther. Now it's my opinion that the anther sort of looks like a smack. If you know the cereal that has the frog with the spoon on the front, I really never eat them, but that's what it looks like to me. It's a smack that pollen sort of gathers on, okay? And what's holding it up is a stalk called a filament. And the reason it's like that is because, let's say a bumblebee or a hummingbird or something like that comes and it visits the flower. Well, those anthers are just sitting up there looking to rub off on that animal, and the pollen is going to rub off on whatever it is that visits the flower. Now, those two things together, the anther and the filament, together we call them a stamen. Now, as far as the female structure, if you look at the very middle of the flower, you'll see at the very top, there's like this flat part. Now, it looks kind of different depending on what flower you are taking a look at. But the stigma is that part at the very, very top, and that is where pollen actually lands. It's not like pollen has a tracking device to land on that part. It's usually a game of chance where the pollen actually has to rub off onto the stigma. And that's why the stigma can sometimes be really sticky, because then it can stick to all the pollen that is on like the fly or whatever is buzzing around on the flower. So then underneath the stigma is what's called the style. And the style is a tube in which the pollen, and actually not the pollen, but the pollen tube, which is what comes out of the pollen, is going to travel down, and then the ovary is at the very bottom, and that's what actually gets fertilized. Now those three structures together are called the pistil. If you're wondering what a pollen tube looks like, by the way, I showed this on an earlier slide. That lighter pinkish part, that's the actual pollen grain, and the purple part is the pollen tube that comes out of it. So when it's time for the sperm to actually fertilize the egg, that tube comes out of the pollen grain, and that's where the sperm actually goes down. That tube is supposed to fit into the pistil there, so the stigma, style, and ovary. When an egg gets fertilized, it develops into a seed. And what flowers tend to do is they develop a structure around that seed called a fruit. Now it's somewhat protective. It's also, it also provides nutrition for the seed. Because let's take a look at this apple. What ultimately ends up happening is your seed starts to form, and then all these layers of sugar form around it. And there is a bit more of hard tissue directly around the seed. That part is slightly protective. The rest is there for nutrition for the seed for when it ultimately goes and grows somewhere else. So let's say this apple gets dispersed, a mile away from the tree it came off of. Well, there's all those sugars and things like that that will be provided to the seed when it's time for the seed to actually start growing, because seeds need a lot of nutrition to actually germinate and start to grow. So a lot of that stuff is packed into that fruit, and that's why it's there. Now, plants can reproduce asexually as well. Now, this is referring to mostly flowering plants here, but you can have what are called bulbs. You can have tubers. Those are what are coming off of the potatoes there. A stolon is like a horizontal vine that comes from a plant. A lot of berries use these. And these are really technically modified stems, but you will see sort of these less regular forms of reproduction sometimes, depending on what kind of plant you're looking at. And that is it for me.